And I'll...
Open the door.
Good morning.
That's good.
Good, how are you? Hopefully that's all good. Hey, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
So we are incredibly lucky today to have Alexander Mathis joining us from EPFL in Switzerland. Alex has done a lot of really amazing work sort of in animal movement estimation, pose estimation, and specifically behavior categorization. His background is in computer science, but he works a lot with neuroscientists as well as ecologists on basically lots of different stuff. But one thing you might have all heard of that he does is work on DeepLabCut, which is a really widely used, incredibly impactful tool for kind of taxa agnostic or very easily adaptable pose estimation for animals in different types of data. And yeah, I'm really excited to hear this talk. And I guess, yeah, Alex, is there anything else you'd like me to say? No. He also is just celebrated his 2nd anniversary of his lab at EPFL. So yes.
Yes, so
take it away.
The 2nd lab anniversary was actually yesterday, which happens to be the National Day in Switzerland, and is always a vacation day. So that's great. And I'm really excited to talk to you guys. And it's a pity that I cannot be there because I think that would obviously be much more interesting to discuss with you. And I hope that despite being via Zoom and most people being over Zoom, having to do Zoom, feel free to kind of interrupt me, ask me questions during the talk so that is actually interesting and interactive. And indeed, I want to talk mostly about pose estimation and how it can be used to analyze movement, identity, and behavior of animals. So I want to start with just this video of 2 zebras, and want to remind everyone that obviously cameras are a fantastic tool to measure behavior. Now, I mean, you can just record videos of animals, what they're doing. And then for us as humans with our exquisite primate visual system, it is actually quite easy to see a lot of information in these videos and to infer perhaps the states of these 2 animals and what they're doing and whatnot. But we should keep in mind that videos are extremely high dimensional, and that training a machine to do the same as we can do and extract kind of the essence of this video of what perhaps is happening between these 2 zebras is actually a really hard problem. And I want to show you a different video of a rather low dimensional description of behavior. And so what you see here is you see a bunch of dots actually that move in a spatiotemporal coherent way, okay? And even though this video has extremely few degrees of freedom and very few bits, you cannot help but see 2 humans walking past each other, 2 humans shaking their hand, 2 humans hugging, and now they just walk away from each other. So this is actually from a very classical video by Gunnar Johansson from the 70s, where he showed that these kind of key point representations of humans, but also of different animals, are extremely useful kind of compressions of behavior, because the essence of what is happening in a scene is still in this. And maybe he wasn't even the first to realize that that's the case. And for that reason, this kind of step going from high dimensional videos to low dimensional pose representations has been kind of a major goal in computer vision for a very, very long time. And so the easiest way to solve this problem of doing pose estimation is what is called marker-based pose estimation. And so in marker-based pose estimation, I mean, I should say, maybe let me go actually one slide further first for a second. So what I was kind of motivating is that with pose estimation algorithms, we can go from these high-level pixel representations to these low-level key point representations. And with this video by Johansson, I was motivating the fact that these key point representations are actually very good and useful, and they're good for downstream tasks because they have very few bits of information and still capture the essence. And pose estimation algorithm, they basically try to make that mapping. They go from either single frames or videos to key points. And the easiest way to do that computationally is to attach markers to body parts, okay? So as you can imagine, or here to the left, there's actually a very classic picture from Bernstein, where what he did is he attached light bulbs to workers, and then they took a single picture. But because the illumination was rather slow, you capture this whole trajectory of the worker, how they swing their arm, how they use the hammer. So here you even have like a trajectory analysis with just a camera, no code required, nothing. But the essence of marker-based pose estimation is already here in this picture, of course. So with marker-based pose estimation, the idea is you put markers at the relevant key points on your animal or on your scene. And because these markers are highly visible and you can pick them, it is then very easy to find the location of these key points in a video or in a photograph based on very simple computer vision methods. So keep in mind, for example, let's say you put a red dot there, then you can just look for the red pixels if that's the only red thing. So the algorithms that you can use to do pose estimation become really trivial with marker-based pose estimation. And before I talk about kind of more pose estimation algorithms, I want to briefly say what you can do if you have pose estimation algorithms. So there's really a lot you can do. So if you have poses of these two zebras, for example, over time, you can cluster them into actions, namely semantically meaningful behaviors that these zebras are carrying out, because obviously a particular behavior like walking towards each other means that the key points undergo a certain kind of transition. You can use pose estimation to relate it to neural data, as up here, where we have, let's say, a joint recording of pose and neurons in the brain of a mouse. And you can use it for biomechanics modeling. Of course, there are also many other additional applications. And I think the field of pose estimation has really changed with kind of the arrival of deep learning in this recent AI wave. And essentially the first paper that applied pose estimation or deep learning to pose estimation is a paper called MoDeep that came out now 8 years ago. And then over the course of the next few years, there are literally thousands of papers. I recently checked, there are more than 30,000 papers that do human pose estimation with deep learning. And what you see to the left here is the output of an algorithm that is very famous and very well known, and it's called OpenPose. So what you see here is a bunch of humans dancing on a pier, and the output of this algorithm is overlaid on these humans. And it's really remarkable performance, obviously. You know, this algorithm can detect the location of the various body parts of the people in the scene when they move around, when the camera is moving and whatnot. And you may wonder, so how does this algorithm actually work? Essentially, like many previous algorithms, it just takes the image and it contains, or it kind of consists of a predictor that predicts the pose. So here pose is really just the X and Y coordinates of semantically meaningful labels. So for example, the X and Y coordinate of my hand, of my elbow, and so on. And the new thing for these deep learning based algorithms is, of course, that the predictor is essentially a deep neural network that consists of many, many, many parameters. And then those parameters are trained based on a large scale data set. In fact, here it's trained on COCO, which contains thousands of annotated images of those 17 key points that OpenPose that can actually predict in novel videos pretty well. Okay, so when I saw this for the first time, I was actually working on analyzing the behavior of a mouse. You will see the video in a second of how that looked. And I tried to do this very simple task. This was in 2017. To track the snout of the mouse, because I was working on odor-guided navigation. And I had a hard time with the algorithms that people were using in neuroscience to actually do this. And then I saw these videos and I was like, why do I have a hard time? It seems like the computer science people are, have completely different skills here. So what we wanted to do is we actually ported then these pose estimation algorithms from the human field to animal pose estimation. And what I kind of want to do on this slide is talk very briefly about kind of the challenges for doing this. So while the previous slide, because I mean, humans are just animals, made it clear that these algorithms should work on animals, it is probably not practical for people in neuroscience or in ecology or whatever field you work in to label tens of thousands of frames and click on the body parts that you want in order to get a model that works. And in particular, this is extremely difficult because many animals that we work with look actually very, very different. And so we would have to create large-scale data sets for lots of different body plans, and that would be a big challenge for the field. And one thing that was, of course, not clear at that time is actually if these algorithms have sufficient accuracy to apply them in biomechanics or in neuroscience. And other things that I want to highlight is that especially in neuroscience, people are very often interested in figuring out what is the cause or what is the neural circuit that gives rise to a behavior. And when they do this, they, for example, do closed loop perturbation experiments of the brain. And so here you would have to kind of detect the behavior, or slightly even before the behavior happens, you would perturb a circuit. So you would like to have a pose estimation algorithm that is extremely fast. And I also want to highlight the challenge of multi-animal pose estimation and tracking. I mean, we saw this video from OpenPose. Clearly, it works on multiple humans. But what we should keep in mind is that humans have different clothing, typically, and that makes us look extremely different. And animals, if you have, for example, a bunch of zebras, they look extremely similar. And there is a question if kind of these technologies actually work on animals that look much more similar in their natural habitat, at least. So these were the challenges that I think the field was facing. And so now to specifically go to DeepLabCut, what we did is we adapted an algorithm called DeepLabCut, which at the time when we did this work was state-of-the-art for multi-human pose estimation. And we actually simplified it. We took out a lot of its parts. And we wanted to see if this algorithm would work on the problems that we had in the lab. So one of the problems that we were working on, in fact, Mathis, she's also a professor at EPFL, was working on this problem, is the problem of tracking the digits of a mouse when they pull a joystick. So you see here to the left a few frames that she annotated with key points that she was interested in. And we then trained a simplified or a subset of DeepLabCut that we then later on called DeepLabCut that is actually very simple. It just consists of a large backbone, as it would be called in computer vision. So in this specific case, it's a ResNet that has like 50 layers. It's a deep convolutional neural network. It is pre-trained on ImageNet. That's important, and I will talk about that in a second. And then we treat this pose estimation problem as an image-to-image translation problem. So obviously you clicked on the body parts, so you know where they are, or your database knows where they are. And so if you want to, for example, now predict the body parts in this image, what you do is you present that image to your deep neural network. You predict the activities all the way forward, and then you make one output image per body part, where you have so-called deconvolutional layers. And in each one of the body parts, you put an image that is basically a probability density over where, if this particular body part is at that particular position in the image, okay? So for example, if you want to predict the wrist at this location, then you would put a high probability there and a low probability everywhere else. And then you train this architecture end to end. And I mean, what we knew from the OpenPose data, for example, is that if we just give it enough images, this would obviously work. The key question for us is how many images do we actually need? And so what you see here is the algorithm applied to a new video of a mouse pulling a joystick. So it's actually a different mouse in the same setup. And obviously in neuroscience, people often have setups. I mean, they're not like in the wild settings with all this variability, but the variability is not small, but it's obviously controlled. And so what was exciting for us is that DeepLabCut here actually worked and generalized to new mice in the same setting with just 141 labeled frames. which in the end of the day, that's less than 2 hours of work of clicking on these body parts. And then you have your tailored specific model that you can apply to your setup and analyze all the behavioral data. And I would say before deep learning, like making a detector for all these body parts in this case of the mouse was actually a really big challenge and would need an expert to do it. But now you just click on a bunch of body parts, you train your model, and it worked, or at least that's what is suggested. One thing that is also quite interesting here, because it's an image-to-image translation problem, the output of DeepLabCut actually gives you a probability. And notice when the mouse is holding the joystick, the fingertips become invisible. And what happens there is the output predictions of the fingertips, the likelihood is extremely low. So we know that they're invisible and we don't plot them, for example, in this output video. Okay? And so that was one of the first experiments that we have in the paper. Another experiment that we had in the paper is actually a fly data that I'm not showing, but I want to show another experiment. This is actually the mouse I was talking about that I was working on at the time. So here you see a mouse on a paper spool essentially, and I had printed odor trails. So this paper spool is moving, and I had printed odor trails on this paper and also printed chocolate milk as rewards for the mice. And as I said, I really wanted to track the snout of this mouse, which doesn't sound like a hard problem. Anyway, with DeepLabCut, we could really do this well. And we quantified the performance in the following way. We got 1,080 different images of different mice. And then one of us in the paper, it's actually a spectacular labeler, annotated that data set twice, more than 1 month apart. And what we verified was that he could actually do this with an accuracy of 2.7 pixels. This is this black line here. So he could do this, he could do this with remarkable accuracy. If you look here at the scale bar 10 pixels, 2.7 pixels is really very close to the original point. And so what we wanted to now check is, can DeepLabCut actually be as good as a human on this task? And so for that purpose, what we took, let's say 80% of the training data, that's roughly 800 something images. We obviously get there a training error, or not obvious, but it is a fact. We got a training error that is lower than human variability because these models are so powerful, they can just memorize the test set, the training set essentially. But what was important for us to test is that if we now show them new images, do they generalize as well as a human to this? And so what we found was that the test error was also around 2.7 pixels. So given enough training images, DeepLabCut really reaches human level accuracy at these tasks. And now what we can of course do is we could vary the amount of images that we present to the algorithm at training time, and we can check how much is actually required to reach a reasonable performance. So for example, if we give 500 different images, do you guys actually see my Yes. If you give around 500 images, the performance is almost the same. And only if you go down to just giving 50 images, you reach, like, your error doubles to around 7 pixel errors. And so, which is to say, for 2 different data sets, we see that with very little annotation data, we can get very good generalization. Now, all of you work in ecology, so maybe you're not so often in the lab, and you may wonder, well, can I apply this to out-of-lab situations? For this, I want to show some really fun videos. Namely, what you see here is a cheetah running on a sanctuary in South Africa. And there are 3 GoPro cameras that you can see on the other side, behind the cheetah, essentially. And on our side, there are also 3 GoPro cameras. And so what we did is we annotated body parts of the cheetah, and we trained one model for to predict the 2D pose for each one of the cameras. So we pooled the data of the different cameras and trained one model for all of them. And so what you see here is that it really works well, even in very challenging, very highly agile animal with like dirt and whatnot. And excitingly, of course, if you now have if you have multiple cameras and you have 2D predictions and you calibrate your cameras, you can of course use classical computer vision to do 3D pose estimation. And so here is an example of that. So what you see in this plane is the 6 different cameras, and then you see the 3D predictions from 3 different methods. The first one is triangulation, where you essentially just, well, you triangulate the points based on the 2D predictions. And the other 2 methods, they kind of take priors into account. So the Kalman filter and trajectory optimization takes kind of spatio-temporal features into account that optimizes this. Obviously, these 2 methods are much better. But the key point here is that you can actually do this with relatively, we can also do this outside of the lab and train your own model. Okay. So with that, I want to kind of give you also one brief take-home message, because maybe not all of you are interested in pose estimation, but I think you're all interested in using computer vision for your applications. And I think the take-home message is essentially the following. What is interesting about deep learning is it really gives us algorithms that scale extremely well with data. Like unlike previous learning algorithms, if you increase the capacity of your model, you can get more and more performance out of it if you have a lot of data on which you train your model. This is what you see in this plot. But I think one big problem in this story is that if you maybe don't have large-scale data sets for the problems that you work on, then maybe we wouldn't be able to utilize deep learning efficiently in the laboratory or in the field. And I think, fortunately, we know that that's not true. And that essentially, if you use transfer learning, so for example, in the case of DeepLabCut, you have this model that has 50 layers. So this is ResNet pre-trained on ImageNet, which is this large-scale data set for object recognition. If you start with those model weights that are pre-trained on a data set, then you can actually reach much higher performance on the task of pose estimation, despite having relatively small data sets annotated. Okay, so that's the key idea behind transfer learning. And obviously, this idea is actually inspired by psychology and neuroscience. Namely, if I would give you guys a problem, a new problem that you have never seen before, you're not going to kind of reset all the weights in your brain, but you would actually use your knowledge to kind of draw smart inferences about how to tackle this specific new problem. Okay. And I want to briefly talk about a specific animal pose estimation benchmark, specifically for robustness, because it kind of can highlight 2 interesting points. And so this benchmark, it's a benchmark of 30 horses that all look slightly different. And you see this video of which body parts were actually annotated. And so the benchmark, we set it up in the following way. We only have access to, at training time, you only have access to the videos of some of these horses, namely these 10, let's say, to the left. And we want our algorithms to generalize well to all the other horses, essentially. And when you think back to the architecture of DeepLabCut, it's really just this ResNet backbone and then a deconvolutional layer. And I was saying that we use transfer learning in the sense that this backbone is actually pre-trained on a large-scale object recognition task. And as you probably know, in computer vision, a lot of people compete on this benchmark called ImageNet and constantly come up with better backbones that are much better at solving this task. So now, with that fact in mind, we can ask ourselves, if someone was to give us a better backbone on ImageNet, would that backbone also be better at pose estimation than a baseline? And we did that experiment, and I'm going to show it to you here. So this is a very complicated plot. So let me slowly walk you through it. So on the x-axis, you see ImageNet top 1 accuracy. So that's how good is the model on ImageNet. Here you see in the middle, you see the ResNet 50, and to the left, there are different models, mobile nets and efficient nets. So this paper is now 1 year old. So these were the models we had available at that time when we did this. And you see that efficient nets are quite a bit better actually than ResNets, for example, at this task. And so what you can see, so here we again plot the training and the test performance. But for the test performance, it's the same 10 horses. It's just different frames of those 10 horses. And notice what what we see here is that if we train our model, then a better model on ImageNet is actually slightly better at generalization to pose, like at doing pose estimation, than a model that is worse. Like for example, the MobileNet V2 is substantially worse at doing pose estimation than is deficient at V3. Of course, the MobileNet V2 also has much fewer parameters. As its name suggests, you could run it on a cell phone. It's a very lightweight architecture, but that's not the point here. Now, what was even more interesting is that, so this is within test performance, but up here, the star with the dashed line, that's out of domain test performance. So here, that's the performance of the algorithm on the unseen 20 horses. And so what you see here is that the efficient nets generalize much better to the other horses than, for example, the mobile nets. And I think that's an important lesson for you guys, because if you want to use algorithms in the wild, then having a bigger backbone is much better for making them more robust. And there's another interesting feature about this, namely, if you actually have enough data for the horses, okay, then you don't need transfer learning. Because if you have enough data for pose estimation, you can just train your algorithm on pose estimation. In fact, and this is shown here as a dashed line, no, as I guess the solid line down here. Namely, if we train the model with just 4,000 annotated images of horses, we actually reach the same performance on the training and the test set as we do with the pre-trained situation. But when we look now at new horses that the algorithm has not been trained on, we see that if we train from scratch, even though we have the same performance on our 10 horses, we have completely different performance on our 20 horses. Namely, the algorithm, because it has not been pre-trained and it doesn't have as good statistics from ImageNet, it actually generalizes less well to new horses. So again, this is kind of makes a good point why transfer learning is really useful if you have little data, because training a model is faster, you need less data, and it's more robust. Okay? And you may wonder, okay, is this only for horses? What about other species? So we did a fun experiment where we had 5 different species, and we held out one species. And what is actually kind of fun is you generalize also better to this new species with a bigger backbone, essentially, as you can see here to the right. Okay. So that would conclude the first part of the talk, where I was mostly talking about transfer learning and pose estimation. And now I wanted to talk about very briefly about whether one can use these kind of algorithms to provide real-time feedback. I think that can also be of interest, for example, if you have camera trap data in ecology or whatnot. And firstly, these algorithms, if you run them on specialized hardware like GPUs, are actually extremely fast. It depends on various things like pixel size and whatnot, and how big is your GPU. And so one thing that we did show, and I think it's also a really nice package to use, is DeepLabCut Live. So it's a very lightweight lightweight package, software package. It's very easy to install because there's very few dependencies, and you can even run it on like embedded systems, for example. And what we showed is that we can use this model to actually give feedback to a dog based on the behavior of the dog. And I have to say, this experiment was done in a dog. In fact, it was done in the dog of the first author, because COVID just hit. We were not allowed to do any experiments anymore. And what you see here is actually the times of different frames that were recorded. And what we wanted to make is we wanted to extract the key points, and whenever the dog was rearing, we would turn on this light, and when this light turned on, we gave the dog a cookie. Notice, so one thing that is actually quite cool here is, if you notice at the second frame, the dog is kind of about to rear, or is in the process of rearing, and the LED is obviously not on. But in the next frame, where the dog is already in this reared pose, the LED is on. So how could we predict so quickly, based on no visual information, that the dog will be reared? Is, of course, we do a forward prediction of the behavior. And so we've built this in, namely that we in DeepLabCut Live, we can forward predict behaviors and based on that trigger something. And this is actually kind of fun because this way you can do, for example, an optogenetics experiment or whatever you want to do with sub-zero latency. So you can overcome the hardware limitations and delays by forward predicting, which, by the way, is also something that the brain does because our sensors are actually relatively slow. And in order to not be unstable, we actually forward predict the sensory feedback that comes from our periphery. Okay, so with that, I would briefly talk about multi-animal pose estimation. So here, what we have recently done is we just published a paper in Nature Methods that is an update to DeepLabCut. And in that paper, there are a few contributions. One of them is that we collected 4 different benchmarking data sets for multi-animals. So to the left is maybe the most generic in neuroscience, a few mice in a box. Then to the second one is a parenting experiment where there's 1 mouse taking care of 2 pups. And the third one is 2 marmosets in a large 3-dimensional cage. And the fourth one is 14 fish in a float tank. Especially the last 2 data sets are extremely challenging, of course, because especially in the 3D kind of tank, or both in this cage and in the tank, the animals can kind of cross on top of each other. So there's a lot of occlusions. And both marmosets and fish are extremely agile animals. So they're really challenging benchmarks. And we've annotated a few 100 to 1,000 images for all these data sets. And we've used those to kind of develop a tailored pipeline that works well and beat some other benchmarks, or that beat some other state-of-the-art methods on this. So to kind of walk you through the basic steps, multi-animal pose estimation consists of 3 roughly steps. The first step is to localize all the body parts. So we've seen that so far already. Namely, I said that DeepLabCut is kind of set up like an image-to-image translation problem. You get an image, you output these peaks. Turns out that if you actually put multiple animals, you will just get multiple peaks. You need to detect all these peaks, and this will be the location of the body parts. But now what you don't know a priori is how these body parts belong together. And interestingly, the way this was solved in OpenPose is that the model wouldn't just predict the location of body parts, but it would also predict joints, or not limbs, as a matter of fact, not joints. I mean, also joints, of course, but that's the same as key points. So it would output kind of a vector field that points between 2 joints if they belong to the same individual. And I'll show you this on the next frame, next slide. And based on the detection of the body parts and of the connections, we can then assemble individuals in a given frame. And then we also need tracking methods to kind of link these different assemblies over time in order to have the multi-animal pose estimation output. So in order to do the detection part, we have built an architecture that is kind of a multitask deep neural network that actually solves the following 4 tasks simultaneously. Firstly, it outputs these score maps. So these are just these probability densities of where a body part is. Notice that here now there's a scenario where we actually have 2 marmosets in the input image, and then we do get 2 peaks and this is, for example, the output of the right wrist of that marmoset. There's also another output that it's called equation refinement. It essentially makes the prediction more accurate because you downsample in your architecture, and that's what the goal of it is, but it's not so important right now. We can maybe discuss it later. And then crucially, there's this part affinity field output where what we actually predict is a vector field that points from, in this case, for example, from the right elbow to the right wrist. And what you can see is that because for this marmoset that has the white tufts, there is no, that elbow is not connected to the right wrist of the blue marmoset, we don't have a vector field that points nicely between those 2. And so in other words, if we take putative detections at inference time, we can integrate the vector fields between these putative detections, and they can then decide whether an elbow belongs to a wrist or not. Okay, And that's actually how inference works, and I will show you that in a second. And one interesting thing that we also build in is that the model can predict the identity with a different head. So it just takes the image, and in this case, they actually marked. That's why I was talking about the blue marmoset and the white marmoset, so they have their tufts dyed. The model just predicts all the body parts of the either blue or the white individual. And then all this is trained in parallel. We've made like a multi-fusion architecture with a multi-stage decoder. We can also discuss this in more detail later. But I think one important problem is actually the question which limbs should be predicted. And we had an early beta release of DeepLabCut, and it was a little bit of a mess because the following situation was happening. So people would, for example, be interested in tracking these 13 points here on a mouse, okay? In this, and you can see this naive skeleton. And now, in order to assemble the individuals, you need to satisfy two things. You need to have a limb, aka a connection between any two body parts, or no, that's not right. For any two body parts in an individual, you need to have a connection in your skeleton that can propagate the identity from one body part to the other one. If you don't have this, you cannot assemble the individual. And so in this beta release, people could draw their skeletons on their own, but people would often like forget to make a connection. And what then DeepLabCut did is it would predict, for example, those key points belonging together and then those key points belonging together. But you wouldn't get a whole mouse. And that was, of course, a mess. And in practice also, if you have a lot of key points, drawing the skeleton is maybe not trivial. And it's also not so easy to have a good intuition of how a skeleton should look in order to do good, to predict individuals and like assemble the body parts correctly. So what we did is we came up with a body plan agnostic graph optimization method. So essentially, the approach is the user doesn't need to do anything. You just label the body parts you're interested in. And then as a first step, we train the model to predict all the possible edges in the graph. And then once we are at evaluation time, we take the training set and we compute which limbs are good at identifying whether, for example, the wrist belongs to the elbow or not. Do I need to go, for example, wire the shoulder or not? That was a stupid example, I guess. Let me give you an example with this mouse. If you, for example, were to give exactly this skeleton as in the naive skeleton, and because these are usually social animals where one climbs on top of the other, if there's another animal on top of this one, oops, sorry, here, then it would kind of, then this prediction cannot be done because, well, there is another animal right on top. So what you would need to have, so you want to have a connection that basically goes over these occluders. And this is really what actually happens with the data pruned algorithm. So down here, this is the optimal skeleton of the same number of edges as the naive one, but it actually assembles much more accurately. And this is what we can see in the next slide. So what you see here is, again, this is a bit of a busy slide. The baseline methods we wanted to beat is a thing called HRNet with associative embedding, which at that time was state of the art for multi-human pose estimation. And so you see the performance here for the different 4 data sets. And then the vanilla DeepLabCut version we call baseline is essentially the one where you take just normal DeepLabCut and you draw the skeleton yourself. And so this is in gray. Notice that if your skeleton is big enough, you already often beat the HRNet. And also the inference time is actually much faster than for the HRNet. But in the data-driven case, what is really cool is that in the case of the mouse, for example, with a skeleton of just 11, you already reach kind of ceiling performance as if you have a graph that has whatever, 35 body parts, edges, okay? And the same is also true for the marmosets. These differences are less pronounced for the case where you predict pups or fish because, well, the skeleton on an object that is a little bit like a 1D manifold is maybe not the most interesting thing. So there's hard to get a difference out of this. So
Alex,
yes,
Alex, the question.
could we ask questions?
yes, yes.
Oh, cool. In this image of the mice on the left, is there a scale or is there any meaning to the color of the points, or is it are the points just there for prettiness?
Well, these are actually the key points that people annotated for those data sets. So
Oh, okay.
the scale of the, like, that's just the size you want to plot the dot with. That's irrelevant.
Oh, got it.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So time-wise, I have 3 more minutes. Is that right? Like,
You like until 10 a.m. So,
okay. So that's,
but like for questions too.
yeah. So I think I'll go maybe for 7, 8 more minutes, and then we can have more questions. So next, of course, we have these assemblies, and we need to then track the animals over time. So this we did, I would say, in a classical computer vision approach. So we came up with a we took a divide and conquer approach, where the idea is essentially, if the animals are far apart, then of course it's very easy to track them, because between any 2 frames, there's no confusion that you can have. So we take very simple kind of online local identity propagation tools, where we just, for example, fit an ellipse to the key points that we have, forward predict the parameters of the ellipse, and match it greedily to the next detection. But then what is more interesting is, so what local tracking gives you is these so-called tracklets. So look at this plot down here. So there would be, let's say, a blue mouse that goes, and then it hits onto this orange mouse. And there's a question, is the yellow one actually the same, the blue mouse, or is this green one the orange or whatnot? And so you need to decide how to link it whenever they come really close to each other. So this, what we call stitching, for that, we defined a bunch of different metrics, and we set everything up like a graph optimization problem. And I mean, this is what it does under the hood in DeepLabCut. You just pick basically the metric, and then it minimizes, so it finds the optimal path through it and stitches your tracklets optimally together, depending on what metric you use. And in the interest of time, I don't want to talk too long about this rather boring bar plot, but you can imagine any one of these metrics works equally well for stitching, and you're much better if you use global reasoning. And if you use the identity of the individual, it's even better. And that's something I will elaborate on in the next slide. This is actually from a figure from a beautiful paper that Sarah and Davis Tuya and many others wrote, and I'm one of the co-authors, but really just in the middle. And the point there is that we're interested in, obviously as a field in ecology, we're really interested in kind of making these maybe digital twins of animals and understanding what they do, which individual does what, and how they change the environment. And so, which is to say, we also need to be able to get the identity of an individual. And I want to show you this short video of 2 marmosets in the cage, where you see DeepLabCut predictions on top, to also motivate you why you really need identity prediction. Because what happens here is a marmoset can go out of view, and maybe actually 2 of them can go out of view at a given time. And now if it comes back, you need to figure out which one is actually which. And so, as I was saying, what we built in this scenario where you actually have marked animals, or for whatever reason you're able to distinguish them, let's say they're zebras, which are marked by nature, then you can use a supervised learning scenario. And what you see here is, for the marmosets, the evaluation, how accurately DeepLabCut can predict the identity of each marmoset for a given body part. So we do this in a body part specific way, and then you can just pool over them. And what is maybe expected is that it's easiest to predict the body part, the identity around the head, where actually they are marked. But it's you even reach an accuracy of around 95% around, let's say, one of the distal limbs of them. And which is to say, overall, this works extremely well for predicting the identity of individuals. And one can actually use this also in the wild. And there was one more thing that we added to the paper method-wise, and that was a metric learning approach to do re-identification. Because this approach that I've described so far, this only works if you actually have marked or labeled individual animals. But what if you don't? Then you can still exploit appearance. And we basically came up with a way where we use, the pre-trained, the DeepLabCut model that is trained on pose estimation. From that, we extracted features, and those features we used to learn to train a transformer on solving a metric learning problem. And so this transformer, what it has to do is it needs to decide for the key point aware features in the last layer of the backbone, in which case it's this kind of the same animal or a different animal. And now you wonder, well, how would I know if it's the same or a different animal? Well, for this, we use kind of the tracklets, because we can use the tracklets and say, okay, I take, for example, two embeddings along this blue trajectory, and that's a positive pair in my triplet learning algorithm, and then one from this orange that's a negative, and then I train this metric learning algorithm to learn an embedding. And here's a quantification that works extremely well, even actually in this challenging case of fish, and in the marmoset case where we don't actually then use any of the labeled data. This works really well. And we're playing around with this now in the wild, and it already looks very promising. So with that, I just want to go back to this original slide that I had. What can you do with pose estimation? You can do really a lot of things like biomechanics, kinematics analysis, action clustering, and so on. And in the interest of time, I just want to point you guys to another review that we wrote, where we really highlight lots of methods by others on what to do with pose estimation algorithms. They're really exciting, cool methods out there. And now very briefly, I just want to say that essentially DeepLabCut, you can, I think it's relatively easy to use. And basically the way to use it is you create a project and you extract the frames and annotate the key points that you're interested in. Then you pick your network, you train the model, you evaluate its performance, and if it's good, you move on and do inference on all your videos or on your frames. And if it's not good enough, then you refine it, and you, for example, like you use active learning, where you find outliers, you fix the predictions of the model on those, you throw them back into the training set, and you train your model. And that's basically what you can do. And I want to highlight one more project related to DeepLabCut for you guys, because I think it's kind of related, because especially I think in the applications that you have in mind for ecology, obviously the variability of the data will be quite big because it's outside, it's in the wild, lots of different animals. So I think what we would like to have there is something like mega detector. No, we would like to have models that generalize really well to across different animals and whatnot. And so this, we're also trying to do something and like this, and it's called the DeepLabCut Model Zoo, where you can already go and download pre-trained models on various tasks. But of course, one challenge for us is that there is not a lot of pose estimation data out there that is annotated in comparison to, for example, bounding box detection, for which you can find much more data. But what we did show, and in particular, one problem is that different data sets often have very different key points annotated, okay? So it's not 100% clear how you could actually pull them together. I mean, you can obviously pull them, but it's not maybe clear how you could train a model with data sets where some body parts are annotated in this one, but not in this one. And then how do you train a model to predict, for example, the superset of all the body parts? And so we came up with a way which basically uses gradient masking, and I can talk about this in a second. But what is cool is you can then, so this is back to this mouse that I showed you earlier, even if you annotate just 4 data points and you train your model, you can obviously only predict those 4 key points. But if you download the super animal model, then in 0-shot performance, it already gives you all these key points on the same image. So it hasn't seen any annotation in this box. And there's some quantification in the preprint on how good this is. And this actually also works quite well for not just lab situations, but quadrupeds in the wild. And so what we have done here is we pooled over a lot of data sets. We trained our super animal models, as we call them, and then we tested them on animals that are really different, which we held out on purpose, like elephants and giraffes. And you can see that the model really predicts them well. And also it works quite well on, let's say, rodents, which were also not in this data set. And so if you want to learn more about this kind of citizen science aspect of DeepLabCut, you can go to this website where you can actually also annotate data sets for ongoing projects where people look at various things. And you can also annotate data for everyone else, and you can share your own data so that we can make bigger, more powerful models. So with that, I come to my conclusions. I was trying to show you guys that transfer learning is really a great way to make computer vision algorithms with less data. It also makes them more robust. I was talking about some novel architectures we did and graph pruning for doing pose tracking in complex social scenarios. I was talking about 2 ways to do re-ID in DeepLabCut, one supervised, the other one unsupervised, and I was very briefly talking about the DeepLabCut models. And with that, I should also acknowledge all my collaborators. So here in bold are the labs that contributed to data. And then, of course, for this work, I should thank Mackenzie Mathis, longtime collaborator, and many people also that are bolded that specifically contributed to this project. And I should also say DeepLabCut is really an open source tool. All the code is freely available. And we're really excited that there's quite a nice community that has emerged now. And for example, we already have over 80 contributions to DeepLabCut's source code on GitHub. So thanks for that. And with that, I'm wondering if you guys have more questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. That was awesome. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much for your talk. This was really interesting. It's really blows my mind, all the things that I could never imagine are being done. My question is, I guess I'm like not super familiar with all of the incredible things deep learning can do. The thing that I'm a little confused about is in your very flexible model where you have like many different species of animal and potentially different numbers of body parts or points. How is your model flexible enough to take different numbers of inputs and outputs depending on the scene?
Wait, why is there a different number of inputs?
Because the different number of body parts. So like you have different, at least from one of your earlier slides, like at least for the outputs, you said each body part had a different like frame output.
Yes, exactly. So you're totally right. So in the vanilla version, for each body part, you basically have you actually have 3 output layers, but technical detail, let's say you have 1. And indeed, one way that we tackle this problem for data sets with different annotations of key points is we just created this superset. This is, by the way, where this term supermodel comes from, because it's the set of all key points across the different data sets. So here, in this case, it's this combined data set. And then for those combined key points, we can, again, assign each key point to exactly 1 output layer. And even if someone then downloads that model and only wants to predict with, let's say, half of the key points, then that's fine. And I think this approach actually works pretty well for, let's say, mice seen from above or rodents, and for quadrupeds seen from the side. And it also generalizes well across those. But I think part of your question maybe alludes to the problem. What if someone would give us a centipede or something? This model couldn't work, no? Whereas if you make your tailored DeepLabCut model, you can, of course, work on centipedes if you choose to annotate so many legs once. But yeah, so I think so that problem of, let's say, how would you make a general model in the model zoo that can actually generalize across animals with extremely different body plans? I think that's an open problem that I think is actually very interesting.
I want to see an octopus. Other questions?
Yeah, about the centipede problem, can you generalize to different limbs by annotating only one of them? Or the octopus by annotating one of them?
Yeah, it's a good point. You can, but in practice, so this could be one way in which you build your model, but in practice, you're better off for performance to annotating all the body parts, I would say. Yeah.
So you had talked about when you were talking about the marmosets that have different dyed tufts, you talked about part affinity fields as like a vector field that points from a potential space, like where one body part could move into another part. Now, is that something that is predicted by the model, or is that something that is that a space that you manually annotate?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's purely trained by the model. So it's actually a remarkable thing, no? So essentially what you do as a user is you only, let's say, annotate those key points that you want to have annotated. And then as such, what we do under the hood is we create part affinity fields for each possible connection between those key points. And then the model needs to predict those vector fields for those edges. And this is, so in some sense, you could argue it's almost a self-supervised task because, well, you don't need additional data to create the task. And it's also a great way to regularize your training. And it is, by the way, this is a predicted test image. It is really quite remarkable, know that the model, that like a CNN can actually solve this task. Because what the CNN solves here is not just the task of saying, okay, this is where your wrist is, and this is where your head is. No, it says, oh, this is your wrist, and this really belongs to this head, and therefore there's a connection here. And if someone else would stand next to me, then there wouldn't be a strong vector field from my wrist to that other person. No? So the model really, in a feed-forward way, solves this kind of, what is it called? Part identity, as part assignment problem. No? Which parts belong to one whole? There's a better word in computer vision that I cannot think of.
Yeah, I have a question about, so I'm aware of data sets that have animals that are labeled, let's say zebras, for example, either grazing with their head down and then alert with their head up. Would you ever, and none of those have been labeled though in this way with points, they're just classifications of images. Are those data sets relevant to a model like this? Like, would you ever use that behavior to predict the pose, or is it more that behavior is then a last step after you've identified the pose?
Yeah, I would say both. No, like for the behaviors that you were mentioning, you could, for example, in the first place, run a pose estimation algorithm, and then based on the pose, you know, okay, it's eating or drinking because the head is down, or things like that. So you take the pose data and you use a simple classifier. And a different approach is actually to really take the whole frame or video, and from there predict the behaviors. Both is possible, and it really depends on the problem, what works better in practice, I would say. You can, for example, imagine that some behaviors you can simply not predict from poses. For example, blushing is extremely hard from point estimation, but it's actually very easy from visual information in a frame, no? And yeah, so, and I should maybe also add, having the bottleneck of key point estimation is very useful for action recognition in general, because it's a very good kind of layer to do sanity checks on. Because one problem, and I think you guys will touch upon this in the course for deep learning, is, I mean, these are extremely powerful methods, and you can sometimes train them with very little data, and you're not really sure that they work beyond your test set. And it's very easy to actually verify in a heuristic way, for example, if pose estimation works. Because if you run it on a video, if your dots randomly jump around, and because you expect kind of biological continuous motion, you can check, okay, is that part of my pipeline reasonable actually? And if you have like a full 3D ConvNet that does action recognition, it's very hard to actually check if it does it well. in out-of-domain settings.
Awesome. Maybe one more question? Yeah.
Is it possible to predict size or age based on distances between parts?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, size obviously, no, like in a 3D, if you do 3D pole estimation, you can then use that to predict the size and so on. Also in a 2D setting, if you know something about the perspective, you can do it. I think for age, it's probably better to directly regress against age. I would say rather than using pose.
Cool. Thank you so much, Alex. This was really awesome. For speaker, and also, Alex, like if it's okay with you, is it okay to share like your email with the class if they're interested in following up? Okay, awesome. So
Yes,
yeah, I'll give you all Alex's contact information if any of you for your project here, but also maybe if this is getting your juices flowing, thinking about other projects you might be involved in. Yeah, please feel free. Awesome. Okay, thank you so much. See you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, guys. This was really wonderful. Have a great course.
Awesome.
Bye.